Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is the sixth episode in season three, and we are starting a new series devoted to witchcraft. So, the opening quotation that Lisa read there for us is from Robert Eggers' The Witch, which came out in 2015. Witches have really become kind of a part of our culture. I mean, we all just celebrated Halloween, and I'm sure we saw lots of witches running around trick-or-treating. And witches have especially become part of our culture in American horror. Of course, witches have gone back to biblical times, but I think if you talk about witches in America, still, I would imagine people usually think of the 1692 Salem witch trials, especially since they seem to pop up in popular culture. I think we talked about them in The Conjuring when we asked why can't we just leave the Salem witches alone. And then even Paranorman, I think, was also about the Salem witch trials. And then, of course, we have Netflix's most recent hit, The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, starring Kiernan Shipka. So witches are a pretty hot thing right now in horror. So our Patreon listeners, because if you support us on Patreon, if you become one of our patrons, you get extra bonus episodes in between our main episodes where we either talk a little bit ahead of time about a topic to give them a sneak peek, or we'll talk more in depth about something. So last week, our patrons heard an episode about our favorite witches because we were getting ready for this particular episode. And so for our series, we're going to do as we normally do. And for the first installment today, we're going to talk a bit about the history of witches and witchcraft and a bit about why we think witches scare us, or, well, why we basically scared witches most of the time, people who weren't actually witches. So let's see. I think a good place to start might be with the text that kind of got the witchcraft trials going in Europe. So in the 1400s and the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, up until the 1800s, really, you had sometimes more than others. Sometimes it became kind of sparse, but numerous witch trials. There were actually inquisitors who would travel around places to investigate, see if there are witches there, or they might be called there, or the Pope might send them, or some sort of church official might send someone to investigate. And we talked a little bit about this, I think, when we talked about possession and the nuns at Loudun in France and those aspects. And of course, then when Europeans came to America, they brought their witch fears with them in the 1600s and the 1700s. But there was a text in 1486 called the Malleus Maleficarum. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, or the Hammer of Witches. And I believe one translation, it's pretty much understood that the witches are pretty much thought of as female. Not to say that there couldn't be male witches, but women seem to be the object most often of these scares or warnings. And the Malleus Maleficarum was basically set up as a series of question and answers over sections to kind of just help you figure out if the person you're dealing with is a witch. So section one was about if witchcraft is real, which of course they thought it was. Section two was about how witches use witchcraft. And then section three detailed the appropriate punishments for those convicted of witchcraft, which I think probably from watching Monty Python, we're all familiar with some of those horrible, nonsensical punishments that witches had to go through. Um, I don't know. What do you guys think of this beginning kind of setup for is witchcraft real? And then if so, who are the perpetrators or the victims that we need to go after?
Well, Mel, I know. I mean, I'm not a historian. I'll just start off with that. But, I mean, my general sense of the Salem witch trials and even the Inquisition and previous things, I mean, a lot of that really did seem to kind of stem from that. I, I don't want to use the word xenophobia because it wasn't necessarily like foreigners, but it was definitely getting rid of witches was a good way to punish people who didn't quite conform to the social norms, so to speak. like I think that was a good root for this, and especially when you have such a heavily religious society as the Middle Ages. Of course you'd have something like the Malleus Maleficarum in order to try to determine who's going to be a witch or not. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the Monty Python thing, which of course is one of those famous scenes from the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where they go through this absurd logic where it comes down to, well, if the woman weighs the same as a duck, then she must float on water and therefore she's a witch. And I mean, I know that the Middle Ages were not nearly as dark and quote unquote backwards as maybe I was taught when I was in middle school and high school. I mean, historians have come a long way since then and said, I mean, there was a lot of culture and civilization that was there, but at the same time, things like this really do sort of give the Middle Ages a bad name, especially when you think of the almost like twisting logic to fit a justification that already has its preordained conclusion, which is this person's a witch and we need to kill them. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, I totally agree. And I think, Monty Python, I agree with you on that. It's like the kind of the insanity of what they're doing and the twisting of the logic is they're making fun of it there. But it's so sad to think that there were places where this stuff was done, like, tying up people who've been accused of being witches and putting them in deep water, thinking, well, if they float, then they must be a witch and we must kill the person. And if they sink to the bottom and die, well, then we'll just, we'll pray for them because they were innocent. And it's like, you're going to die either way. So there's no way of getting out of that. And the just weird, the fact that it was rarely, one witch and done. You torture the person until they would give up names of other people just to kind of stop being tortured. And then, the person who accused another person of being a witch, for whatever reason they do it, maybe they are superstitious or maybe they just want to get that person out of the way. The original accuser sometimes would then be taken as a witch because it's like, if you knew she was a witch, then you must be a witch, And then it's like, if you try to stop so-and-so from taking this person as a witch, then you must also be in her coven or whatever. And it's like now we would like laugh or chuckle, but, real people were burned. Real people were tortured to death. Real people were drowned. Not quite in the numbers maybe as they were in Europe here in America. But of course, there's all the killings of witches that maybe weren't in history, people that it wasn't written down or reported. But yeah, it's like, it's an easy way to point the finger at someone who's different, but then the kind of, hysteria is probably the wrong word because that word is so problematic, but the kind of mass mob mentality that comes from that, the root of the superstition, but then also the way as humans we use superstition for our own purposes. And then it just kind of catches on fire and goes from there.
Catches on fire, no pun
I know.
intended,
I just
right?
realized. Yeah, I just realized there was a nice little pun there.
Well, and I was going to say, like, one of the things that I mean, with just these witch mania, I don't know what else to call it, but it's almost like once that accusation gets leveled at someone, they have such an enormously uphill battle that it's almost, I mean, it's a catch-22. They'll never completely disprove that they were a witch, and even if they were to somehow disprove it, more likely than not, they'd already be dead because the trial would kill them either way, or they would still be an outsider and an outcast because, that's that person that was a witch, but we all knew she was a witch, but she got out of it. Like, it's a long far cry from that guilty until proven innocent of our modern day court system, which, may not always be the case. But more often than not, I like to think it is. Whereas with something like witches, just having that accusation leveled at you was enough to basically be practically a death sentence, I think. Just because there is no good way to convince people that you're not a witch if they're looking for like signs and omens and, portents that you are. So, Yeah.
Yeah, it's already been decided, it's like you've been accused to be a witch, therefore you must be a witch. And if you say you're innocent, you would, because a witch would say she was innocent to get out of it, it's it's torturous.
Well, and some of the things too that they used as, I guess, like quote unquote evidence, because that is what I find so fascinating about, especially when you go back and read some of these. I'll just go ahead. Matt, you said you're not a historian. I'm not either. Um, and I'm much more familiar, I think, with the witch trials that happened in America versus the ones that happened in Europe. Um, but when you look at some of the evidence and you read some of the original documents, I read some of the, for instance, some of the Cotton Mather documents with the Salem witch trials, and they were trying, especially Mather was trying to approach it as a man of science and like, let's look for evidence and let's be, let's be smart about how we look at this. But then you look at some of the evidence that they would have, and of course, they had accusations from people. And so it became a he said, she said, or sometimes a she said situation. But then also just things that were very circumstantial, like, well, you looked at my child, and after you left, 2 days later, my child died. Therefore, you killed my child. Or we got into a fight over a fence that was on our property because your horse broke it and you're refusing to fix it. And later that night, I saw a black cat cross my path, and I know that was you. And so it was very odd even to see some of how the trials were constructed, because I think sometimes it was a no-win situation, where they targeted people specifically wanting to get rid of them, wanting to get them out of their community. But then, and especially when you're looking at like Salem and things, it was just so bizarre the way that they approached it, because you saw some people, I mean, we use like, Mel, I agree with you. The term hysteria is problematic on many levels, but that's the word that's most often used when talking about this, is that there was just kind of mass hysteria. But in reality, there were people there who were trying to do their best to be logical and to look at the evidence. It's just that when we look at the evidence that they were looking at, it's laughable today. Uh, to think that because you saw a black cat cross your path, clearly that means your neighbor is a witch. Or because, I'm looking, one of the ones I had looked up was a case actually before Salem witch trials of Goody Garlic that happened in East Hampton, New York. And one of the things when she was first accused, it was a young woman who had just given birth to her first child. And I mean, we're talking, within days of giving birth, and she was very ill, and she was running, she was feverish, and basically she's hallucinating. And she said she saw her neighbor with a black figure standing next to her. Well, we look at it now and think, okay, she was probably very ill after childbirth, and they looked at it as clearly the devil is involved. And so it's, to me, that is one of the things that's so fascinating about it, is not just the factors that went into it, but how they worked through the evidence and the logic in their own minds to accuse these people and essentially sentence them to death. Although in Goody Garlic's case, she was one of the happier endings. They did not find her guilty, but Matt, as you alluded to, she was never fully accepted after that.
Well, and that's the problem too with a judicial system that accepts things like spectral evidence,
Right.
I mean, I could live, for up until just recently, I lived in West Virginia, right? And so I could be like, Lisa, even though Lisa lives 850 miles from me, I swear I saw her ghost figure, near my cow last night and then the cow died, or she came in my house and took something or whatever. And they would believe this because spectral evidence was a thing that, if you believe that people can like astrally project themselves, and that evil things can appear to you, even if it's a hallucination or a nightmare, or I just make it up because I don't like the person I'm accusing, it doesn't matter. It's like, to us, it's bizarre, but to them, it'd be like, ah, yes, this is evidence of a specter. And it's like, no, like one person can't say they saw someone's ghost before something bad happened and therefore that person did it. That's what we say. But at the time, that kind of evidence, while some judges were against it, using it, and would rule not guilty, there were some that would actually take that as evidence. And I think Cotton Mather talks about that a bit in his writing on witches.
Yeah. Yeah, Cotton Mather is one of those really interesting characters when you're looking at this history, because and it's almost laughable because some of the evidence that he looks at, like you said, Mel, it is kind of ridiculous to us as spectral evidence in particular, but he comes across as more of the more level-headed ones, and actually trying to work through some of the evidence and not just get wrapped up in the drama that was happening of the day. Yeah, but yeah, I think we do forget that, number one, the supernatural was very real, and they had this textbook, but they also had the Bible, and the Bible quite, famously says, what is it in Exodus? Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. I mean, this was something that they took seriously, and they were not going to let it be a part of their lives. We could sit here. We've been talking about, of course, when you bring up witches, especially witches in America, it's hard not to talk about Salem, and it's hard not to talk about these witch trials. But that could be a whole episode on its own. I will go ahead and throw out that if any of our listeners are interested in that, Aaron Mahnke of Lore podcast fame has a new podcast out called Unobscured, and this first season he's looking at the Salem witch trials, and it's been really interesting. And Stuff You Missed in History class has done a couple of them. In fact, they just did one recently, I believe, on Goody Garlic, and that whole story is very fascinating, especially if you're interested in pre-Salem witch trials in America, because a lot of people forget that it happened elsewhere too. But I am curious, Matt and Mel, to talk to you about some of the ideas about just a witch in general, because when we think about witches in our culture, they are so ingrained. I mean, probably the first thing that popped into your head was Margaret Hamilton and her black robes and green face in The Wizard of Oz, because that seems to be the typical witch that we think of. Now is changing, and we're going to talk about how it's changing probably in a few episodes, how this idea of the witch is changing. But traditionally, I feel like it's usually the word crone is usually interchangeable with it, but it's like this old woman with this long hooked nose, and for some reason she always wants to eat children, which I never fully understand. But in fairy tales in particular, like Hansel and Gretel, the witches are always wanting to like devour children. And even in, the Disney fairy tales, the witches, the evil queens, which are basically witches, because they all have some sort of magical powers and they're older. They want to destroy the younger ones. She may not have wanted to eat Snow White, but she sure wanted her heart. So there's this sinister aspect and a cannibalistic aspect about them, which is really interesting. But I'm curious, like, what that says, because Mel, you mentioned when you started talking about the and I'm going to butcher this name, Malleus Maleficarum. When you started talking about that, and you said that specifically it was referring to the female version of the word witch. So witch, even though you can have, I guess wizards and warlocks and that sort of thing, it's talking about a very specific type of woman. And I think, I don't know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, first I just want to say, in defense of the witch from Hansel and Gretel tried to eat her house, you know. Uh,
But to be
so
fair,
they were trying to consume her house. She didn't want to be homeless.
wait, before you say that, yes, I hear that argument a lot, but let's look at the facts here. Her house was ready for children to eat, right? She had apparently a big child-sized pot already, going in there. She had cages, ready to put them in so she could fatten them up. My thing is, we don't need to feel sorry for this woman. They were not eating her house and she was a helpless woman and just defending herself. She built a house out of gingerbread in order to get them there. Like that whole thing was there to catch children. Let's not pretend.
Okay.
That's how I feel about Hansel and Gretel, because I've heard that argument a lot. Is everybody's like, no, the witch was not the villain. The children were. And I'm like, no.
We'll have to save my interpretation of Hansel and Gretel for when we do the Evil Children series.
Right. Maybe that should be our test, right? Like, instead of a glass half full, a glass half empty, what kind of person are you? Are you the witch was the serial killer trying to lure children in? Or was it just evil, spoiled children running amok in the woods? I feel like that says a lot about our inner personalities.
The Hansel and Gretel personality test. It started here, people. It started here.
I also noticed Matt is being very quiet during this, and I feel like he should have to weigh in.
Oh, well, I'm just listening here. Didn't want to come between the two of you in the fight that you're having over whether or not the witch is bad or not, but didn't want to get caught in the crossfire. But I will say, I can see both sides. Like, the kids were trying to eat her house, but I mean, if I caught someone trying to eat my house, I would not cook them. So I'm just saying, I might go with a little bit more towards the witch as the villain, but Hansel and Gretel were kind of bratty. So, I mean, they did get kicked out by their parents. So
I was about to say, well, did they get kicked out, or were they left to starve in the woods?
Well, they were left to starve because their parents weren't able to feed them. But
just everybody in the story was evil. From the parents to the kids to the witch.
Yeah, okay. All right. Yeah, the true evil in that story is the society that allowed the parents to leave their children in the woods to starve. No, but when you think about the character of the witch, and I guess this is just what I've kind of been thinking of, is if you take the like the religion out of it, because there are instances in folklore where a witch is not necessarily connected to a Satan worshiper. That feels like that happened, Mel, as you said, around the 1400s, maybe a bit earlier, but there are certainly instances in folklore and in mythology where there were witch-like characters, but they were not necessarily Satan worshipers. And when you look at that character, it is traditionally the old woman. And when I think about it, I think, well, she's the woman that doesn't fit what society wants her to be. And that kind of goes back to something, Matt, you said at the beginning, which is that witches in general are people, or women specifically, who don't fit the prescribed role, because the fact that they're old, they're past childbearing years, so they've outlived their societal purpose, I guess. They usually live on their own outside of town, so they're seen with suspicion because they don't have they don't have really a need for a man. They and I think the cannibalism, the desire to eat children probably comes from that idea of, if a woman is supposed to be a mother, then they are like the anti-mother. They're going to be the opposite of nurturing and caring. But one thing I find really interesting is that these witches are usually portrayed as pretty clever and pretty smart. Which you would think now that is something, here's a woman that has power and has agency, but of course we've got to make it evil now because there's a woman with power and agency. She has wisdom, but that's dangerous. So we're going to make witches dangerous, which I find, I don't know, maybe I'm reading way too much into it, but I find that aspect of the kind of traditional witch, as it's presented in a lot of these fairy tales and folklore, I just find it really fascinating.
Oh yeah, and I think it all revolves around power, and it also revolves around the hierarchy of the society that's set up. Because, like you said, an older woman who's living outside of town is like the complete opposite of what people think a woman should be, which is a man, chooses a woman and they marry in order to produce children. And you can see how religion would get involved in this as well. And so if you have a single woman who has not, married and is unattached, if you have a single woman who happened to, by some fluke, inherit property or own something, that's a second strike. And then if you have any sort of woman, particularly a single woman who doesn't have any children, I mean, then you don't even have to be old to be a mark, right? Because you're not fulfilling any of the purposes that people would think that women were supposed to serve. Not that men wouldn't get accused of being witches. If you're eccentric, if you had a disease of some sort that caused you to have a tremor, or if you had a hunchback or something if you look different, if you act different, if you have some sort of illness that they don't know what it is, those sorts of things will set you apart too. But I think there's also really interesting gender and race in some cases, and class imbalances that they're using this violent exhibition to correct.
Mel, as you're talking about all of these kind of, I guess, characteristics that go into the traditional witch of what people had thought of, these fairy tale type. We mentioned Hansel and Gretel, which the witch in that fairy tale. And it reminds me a lot of it, kind of going back to the idea of witches not necessarily being connected to the devil or devil worshippers in the way they were in like the Salem witch trials. And that kind of goes back to a character like Baba Yaga. And so for those of you who are not familiar with Baba Yaga, she's really fun. But she is, I think, from Slavic folklore. And she is that kind of traditional witch because she's presented usually as an old crone. She's got usually she's drawn very thin but very wrinkly, and she's got kind of this like hook nose. She's not green, but she has that look about her. But if you look at who she's supposed to be, so she flies, and I'll just kind of back up a little bit to say that Baba Yaga is usually presented almost like a type of supernatural monster. Like she's not necessarily, like I said, just a regular old woman who suddenly decided to sell her soul and write her name in the devil's book. She's got her whole mythology that goes along with it in the way any other kind of mythological creature would have, or supernatural character would have. But she flies. She flies through the night. Sometimes they have her described as like she's flying on this kind of giant mortar and pestle. Sometimes it's a broom. So that aspect of witches, that's where we got that from as well. But what I find really interesting, besides where she lives, because this is one thing I wish we had kept, she lives in a house that is up on chicken feet. And that's what people look for, is out, I guess, kind of out in the wilderness, out in the woods, this house up on chicken feet. And I live down on the coast, and we have all these raised houses, that are kind of up on stilts. And now I really want to go decorate one of them to look like big chicken legs. But that may just be me. Anyway, Baba Yaga, so she's, like I said, she's this mythical character. And one thing that's really interesting about her is she is known for being wise. And so people will seek her out. And like any good kind of like a troll or something, if you find her house, you're allowed to ask her a question, and she can answer it for you, because she's, again, known as being a very, very wise old woman. She has a lot of knowledge that goes along with her her years, I guess. But you run the risk of, and depending on the folklore you read, either she can decide just by looking at you, I guess, okay, I will either answer your question or I will eat you. So you run that risk. Or sometimes you have to answer a riddle. And if you can answer the riddle, and then she'll deem you worthy, and then she'll answer your question. And if you get the riddle wrong, she'll eat you. So there's this idea that you approach Baba Yaga with a sense of not only adventure and bravery, but knowing that it may not turn out well in your favor. And she was also known as to kidnap children. So I think she was one of these that parents would probably use as they were tucking their kids into bed at night, kind of like, don't get out of bed because Baba Yaga will get you. But so again, we see a lot of those famous tropes that go along with the witches, kind of all work together in this one, which is really fascinating, because I really did not know much about her before that. I just always assumed witches were, kind of came out of like the witch trials, that they were always just, well, an older woman who's in league with the devil, but that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I get the sense that in some cases witches almost kind of embody almost like a trickster sort of thing. Like you said, if you find Baba Yaga's house, you get to ask her a question, that kind of thing. I wonder if there is a little bit of that trickster element in at least the portrayal of them as they've evolved.
Yeah, I don't know. And I wish I knew a little bit more about just the history of these witch-like characters too, because, and I'm just making a guess here, but with the things that happened in Puritan society or in Christian society across Europe and America, that it wasn't one of these things where they were just going to take the local folklore and then suddenly make it real, by throwing, the devil made me do it kind of out, as an excuse for things. I don't know, because I can't think of any other like folklore character that we really did that with. You know what I mean? Yeah, as far as I know, well, I mean, I don't know. We kind of did that with a vampire too, because there were certainly people who were, swept up in the vampire hysteria, to use that word again. I don't know.
Mel, what are your thoughts?
No, I can't really come up with any other figure that works on that kind of outcast. What's the word I'm looking for? Design, other than I don't know. Vampires weren't really outcast people, but it was more disease related.
Right. Yeah.
I was trying to think of another figure that would work like the witch, and I'm not really sure there is one, like you were saying, Lisa.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting because just like I said, from the little bit I know about witches and folklore, and I know Baba Yaga is one example, but if you look at any, Matt, you mentioned the trickster character, and there was certainly a character in some different Native American cultures that we would think of as witch-like, that were almost like a a trickster, that because they could change shapes and that sort of thing, and cause trouble for people. So, this idea of the witch is embedded in a lot of different cultures, but we co-opted it, in such a large way. And yeah, you're right, Mel, with the vampires, it was attached um to illness. And in fact, most of the time somebody was accused of being a witch, a vampire, not a witch, excuse me. When somebody was accused of being a vampire, they were usually already dead.
Right.
So it didn't quite carry the weight. I mean, now you have people like flocking to the graves of people like Mercy Brown and that sort of thing, to see the New England vampire. But we kind of know that as we can recognize that it was just an illness that they didn't understand. But I would hazard a guess as to say, like, when we took this concept of witch and turned it into something completely different, it became very real, in a way that we're still looking at it today. I mean, we're still dealing with that today.
Yeah, well, you were talking about Native American trickster figures and the idea of witches in other cultures, I was thinking to myself, that's the double, the kind of double bind of witches, or the ambiguity about witches, is because you can't, I mean, I don't know if I would go so far as say good witches, but there are people who have access to just medical knowledge that maybe other people didn't have, or they help people, or they use magic, quote unquote, to help people, or they have special knowledge or wisdom. It's very easy for those people to be seen as a help to the community, like as a midwife and a doctor and that sort of thing. But it's also very easy to be like, ooh, you have this power. I mean, I can see the coin flipping from your powers are helpful to us versus this is scary. And I wonder if I don't know, I wonder if when you add certain versions of religion into the mix, if that turns it sometimes. Like, a person who has that kind of power in one culture might be seen as a helpful person, as a midwife type figure, a doctor type figure, a community guide or something, and a healer. But if you put, like, say, maybe a Western religious view on it, it'd be like, no, this person doesn't fit in, and they have this power that God should have, and therefore, no matter what good they may be doing for us, we got to get rid of them. I wonder if it's that societal and religious lenses that change or turn what we think of witches, or how we think of witches, or who can be witches.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because basically the concept that we have of witches, and I'm talking about fictional witches. We probably should have mentioned that at the beginning of the episode, that we're talking about these fictional witches and not necessarily people who practice, like Wicca or anything like that. But these kind of fictional representation of witches, we still very much see through a very strict Puritan lens. Because you're right, Mel, in any other culture, these witches may be seen as a helper. I mean, Baba Yaga, going back to that example, at times she was seen as a helper because she had access to knowledge, and people would seek her out in order to find answers. And so, yes, she was dangerous, but she held answers. And when you brought up midwives, it really kind of clicked into my head because, and again, I haven't done too much research on this, but I think I read somewhere that one of the reasons that midwives, for instance, was not as big in this country as it has been in other cultures is because of that idea that if a woman holds too much knowledge and power, it's unnatural. And I know that, like in Salem and in some of the other places, men were accused of witchcraft as well. It was a thing that men, women, and children were all accused of. But I think specifically when you're looking at a woman, if she, tried to help heal your daughter, for instance, Because she had some herbs that she knew might help. If the daughter got well, that was great, but you would still be looked at suspiciously. Well, like, how did you do that? Only God is supposed to be able to heal somebody. Or if the daughter then died, well, then it's your fault. And so it's that kind of double-edged sword. But I feel like if we were looking at it from another culture, those women might have been celebrated, like you said. And so it is a very Puritan idea of, number one, women are supposed to be beneath men. So they can't be the ones to hold the knowledge. And two, God is over everybody. And so you can't take these certain powers from God. And so that distorts our idea of what a witch is, because we're still looking at it from that Puritan point of view. Because I don't want to belabor this point, because I could ponder this idea for a while. Is how, because we mentioned like our idea of it now, and so I think maybe starting specifically in like the 20th century, and I already mentioned one, of course. Well, actually, I mentioned two, because I mentioned Snow White earlier, and Disney's Snow White is certainly, you've got that witch character of the evil queen, and then I mentioned Margaret Hamilton and the Wizard of Oz, and those are kind of our. I feel like for me, those are my cultural touchstones for the fictional witch. But it goes back even earlier. And Mel, you had introduced me to a film from 1922.
Yeah, I kind of stumbled upon this movie by accident, and when I saw it, I knew that it was something that we had to use for a episode that we ever did on witches. So this is the movie. I'm probably destroying the name of the movie with my pronunciation, because it was financed by a Swedish company and filmed in Denmark. So I'm going to go for my best pronunciation here. It's Haxan. I've also seen it spelled out as Hexan, Haxan. And this is a kind of documentary that came out in 1922 as a silent film. It was directed by Benjamin Christensen. And there are two versions, actually, which, Lisa, did you have a chance to watch some of the original?
I watched the original 1922. So I guess the original silent one.
Yeah, there are apparently two versions, which I discovered by accident. So 2 days ago, I was like, I'm going to watch this movie. And I sat down, and it was on Amazon Prime. I found a version. It was the 1967 version, which is where William Burroughs reads the title cards as translated. So he's your narrator. And then there's like this really weird kind of improvisational jazz playing during a lot of disturbing scenes. But the movie is in 7 parts. If you watch the original, it's silent with some kind of scary classical music playing, but it's kind of like weirdly, I don't know what the word would be, like mesmerizing or something to watch, because it kind of takes you bit by bit, and it's like to be continued, and then it'll come back. And so the first part is basically like a history lesson about the Middle Ages, which, as Matt mentioned earlier, we now know more about that than they probably did in 1922. But they talk about the hierarchy of Western religions and what the people in the Middle Ages thought, how the people thought that the world was, where heaven was, where hell was, that sort of thing. And literally, these are pictures from textbooks with someone using a stick of wood or like a pencil to point. There's like a pointer, and they're showing you all of this.
which by the way, like, it shows you a lot of these old drawings and like wood cuttings of witches, and those are eerie enough. But then it switches really, really quickly when you first start it, where it's like they built this model of the universe. And
yes,
there are like stars and planets, like hanging down, and that, yeah, it's interesting.
I particularly love the clockwork model of hell, where they're like throwing people into the flames over and over and over again, like really fast.
It was like it was a cinematic quality of, but kind of if like a high schooler was doing a project for school.
and did archival research.
I mean, yes, like like I said, it was Hollywood quality. There was obviously a lot of artistry went into creating these models and things, and a lot of research went into it. But it did for a while, kind of, and it was mesmerizing, but like also kind of charming. You're watching that and realizing that they had created these whole models.
Oh, yeah. And then you get to the live action part with the people acting out different things, and it's like a drug trip or something. There's like Black Sabbath frolics and sacrilegious, blasphemous things happen. They're upset. I think they mentioned 4 or 5 times that women had to kiss the posterior of Satan at the end of the Black Mass. It was like, why did I have to see this over and over again? And then the devil is like running around tempting women out of their bedrooms and.
I mean, I guess if you're gonna sign Satan's book, then there's a certain I don't know, you're expected to do a certain number of things.
There was a certain number of things going on.
But yeah, it was very like yeah, it was sexual and I don't even know how to describe it. It was just bizarre. It was bizarre.
In non-1922 ways.
Well, I guess even this was the silent era, so this was before we got a bunch of codes put on movies, right? I mean,
that's true, and it was made in Europe, so.
Right.
One of my favorite bizarre parts that I had actually blocked, I think, until I was reading an article about Haxan later, but is where the woman, well, this is a very sad part. So there's an extended interlude where they show how it ruined people's lives, obviously. So there's this poor old woman who is accused of being a witch, and she is tortured. And I mean, it shows a lot of the torture. And then she basically just starts saying all sorts of like stuff because she wants them to stop hurting her. And so she talks about how she gave birth to like demonic children, and they literally show her like giving birth to these huge animal people things like, and bugs and stuff, which is just kind of surreal. And then of course she accuses all the people who accused her and other people because she just wants them to stop torturing her. Then they show a convent where nuns basically were claiming the devil was making them do certain things that was similar to the Loudun situation. And then they have an extended part where he actually pulls out the director starts talking using I in the title cards, and they show like representations and replicas of the torture instruments that were used. And then they don't show you in all this bloody glory, of course, but they show you pretty close to when it would hurt the person to show you how it works. So they show how you stretch somebody. They actually, one of the actresses asks to use the thumb screws to see what it's like. And so it shows her out of character using the thumb screws. And then the title card, she's saying how horrible it is. They showed how they would break people's legs. They showed how they would pinch them in sensitive areas of the body. They showed all the mental torture they would use. And they talked about some of the scripture they would use to like torment you over and over again, and the starvation and stuff like that. That part was really interesting because it was more documentary-like, I guess, than the reenactments. But it's a fascinating movie, and I kind of wish I had seen it earlier because I feel like while it's in 1922 and it needs some updating, yes, what they were doing, they were talking about all the stuff that we've been talking about in this episode is like, what happens to people who are poor or older women or people who are different? Well, this is what happens. And that tormented, twisted logic. And at the end of it, he talks about this new thing, hysteria, and how he basically thinks that we're treating people with hysteria in the same ways we used to treat people as witches. Like we just throw them in asylums where they're treated really horribly, or we lock them up and isolate them away from everybody, and we don't actually try to look into what the real problems could be. And while the end was problematic to me in some ways, I thought it was interesting to be like, hey, people, it doesn't matter that's not the 14 or 1500s. Like, we're still doing this to people who seem different. So, yeah, I recommend checking it out, but it might give you nightmares. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of glad I found the original 1922 and I didn't find the one with William Burroughs, because I can just imagine that would add to the nightmarish quality of it.
It really did. And I actually fell asleep while I was watching that one. And I'm so glad that I didn't have any dreams. Or if I did, I was protected by forgetting them.
Yeah, Haxan is one of those films that I would like to see more people know about, more people watch. Mel, I think you had found earlier that the actual 1922 version was one of the inspirations, I think, behind the Blair Witch Project, and that they actually the filmmakers who made that actually named their production company Haxan Films, which is pretty interesting. Um, so it's still a part of our culture. But yeah, I think in a lot of ways it was a product of its time, but it was also ahead of its time, in the way it was asking people to think, even though it got some things wrong. One thing I will say, because I know we're running long on time. We've mentioned, or I've mentioned at the beginning of the episode, how Margaret Hamilton is kind of our quintessential cultural witch. That's our touchstone when we think about witchcraft and pop culture. But around this time, we start to see things shift a little bit. And I'm just going to kind of throw this out here as a transition into our next episode and to kind of get people thinking for our next episode. We move pretty quickly from the old crone hag. We haven't used that word, but that was used a lot. The kind of old hag character. We move far from the Baba Yaga, because if the Wizard of Oz was in 1939, by 1942 we have I Married a Witch with Veronica Lake. So you start to see some much more beautiful, seductive, dangerous women that are now being labeled as witches. And that brings up a whole new issue of how we view femininity and sexuality of a woman in particular. So yeah, I just kind of want to throw that out there, because it starts to change. It starts to change around the middle of the 20th century. So yeah, I'll just throw that out there as be thinking about that for our next episode.
Well, and one last thing before we completely wrap up the episode, I just wanted to remind everyone to rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher or Spotify or wherever it is that you're listening to this, because those do help other people see us and get to see us. And as was mentioned previously at the very beginning of the episode, we do have a Patreon page set up where for $5 a month you unlock 2 mini episodes a week that are released during the off weeks. And something that I mentioned in our last mini episode that we had only discovered between recording the main episode and the mini episode was that there's a new integration between Patreon and Reddit, where if you're a Patreon supporter, you're able to use special Patreon logo flair on our subreddit, which is a nice subtle way of saying that we've been on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook for a while, and we have our website nofearcast.com, but we now also officially have our very own subreddit, so you can go to us, reddit.com/r/nofearcast, and please come join discussion, post links. We will try to be active and respond to everybody just the same way we do with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. So one more social media platform for us to monitor. So thank you once again for listening, and we'll see you next time.